In-depth journalism in the Memphis community, the Daily Memphian is of Memphis, not just in Memphis, and seeks to tell the stories of this city. TheDailyMemphian.com. Truth in place.
Welcome back to another edition of the Daily Memphian's Memphis Grizzlies podcast. This is your host, Grizzlies beat writer Drew Hill, joined as always by columnist Chris Herrington. It's the thick of the offseason, Chris. Not a whole lot going on, but we do have a little bit of Grizzlies news. We have several things I want to get into today, a few offseason topics for us to discuss. But let's start with the dreaded news release, the dreaded Grizzlies PR release just before the season. Now, not quite the day before the season like the Steven Adams news that broke last year, but a month away from training camp, we get news that GG Jackson has broken a bone in his foot. He is slated for surgery today, actually, as we record this on Wednesday. And they did not put a timeline on this injury, but if you look at players that have recovered from similar injuries, looks like he could miss a month to begin the season. You never know, it could be more, but I'm doubtful that he will be ready when the season begins. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think, I think the standard practice now is that they will put, to the degree they put a timeline on it, that'll come after the surgery. There'll be a press release that will announce he had a successful surgery. And then it won't be a timeline in the sense of is expected to return at a certain date. I think my sense is that the NBA is sort of shied away from that kind of reporting, but it will be and then people will wring their hands about this, but I'm just going to tell you ahead of time, it will be reevaluated and then it'll give a date, and people will freak out about that because it won't be at announced return date. They're not going to announce a return date ahead of time. It'll be a reevaluated in. I don't know. I mean, what do we know other than like context clues, right? But my expectation would be that he'll miss a month or so. Could be more than that, but like a month or so. I mean, this is an injury that happened 2 months ahead of the regular season beginning. So, it seems like it's often more of a 3 month or so, 3 or 4 month kind of injury. It could be less, it could be more. But if you take that as sort of a middle of the pack kind of situation, then he misses a month, maybe 6 weeks, something like that. My expectation is that he'd likely be back before midseason.
What do you think this means for the roster overall? We didn't think he would play a ton of minutes, but he did give the Grizzlies some options, especially in the front court. What does this mean to the start of the season?
I think at the moment it's a bigger blow for GG Jackson than it is to the Grizzlies. That could change if they have other injuries, but at the moment, I think it's a bummer for GG Jackson because, he had a great finish. Once he broke through, he had a great rookie season. Once he got going in the second half, had a really strong summer league after a rough start. Really poised to be in the rotation from the jump on a good team, but has not had a training camp, to prepare for a role that he knows he's going to play with the other good players on the team. And so I think he would have really benefited from that training camp and that preseason and getting used to that role he was likely going to have coming off the bench on this team. And now he's just going to have to wait on that. And if other guys step up in his absence and are playing well, it may be a little bit harder for him to break in. So I think it really hits it's the delay for GG Jackson. I think it's long term, it's probably not a big deal, but I think it's sort of bad for him, at least initially. I think for the Grizzlies, not having GG Jackson and instead having, a Jake LaRavia or a John Conchar fill that role, or tightening your rotation, or maybe Scottie Pippen gets more run and you play a little bit smaller. I think all of that is not that big of a deal. I think the issue for the Grizzlies would be it's less margin of error if other injuries happen, because they already are likely starting the season with a 14-man, not 15-man roster. And now one of those 14 spots will be a player who can't play in GG Jackson. Another will be a player who shouldn't be expected to play much in Derrick Rose. And so, I think you're fine in the absence of other injuries, but it does, like, if you have other absences, even if it's like, a guy out for a week with a twisted ankle or whatever, it really, coming out of the last season, I think people are right to be have a little trepidation about the depth and the team's ability to go deep in its roster.
I do think that is the case. I think it's a bummer for Taylor Jenkins too. Just because I felt like there would be some experimentation here, right? And trying to figure out what the correct combos are. We've talked about Gigi potentially being able to play at the 4, and how important Jaren is. And I mean, I think we got into it a little bit last week and talked about how, we would probably expect that Jaren's going to play a lot of minutes because he does work in every combination. But I would have liked to see if Gigi could play next to Edie and what that would have looked like, and if that would have held up defensively, and if Gigi's rebounding, could hold up, and be helpful for the Grizzlies in different combinations that might be with Santi or another player of that sort. And now we're going to have to wait to see that. And I think it's going to be harder for Gigi to get acclimated. It just naturally will be because, and this is something we can talk about in a little bit, I do think that a lot's going to change when these guys get healthy, and like who's going to be on the ball more often and where the shots are coming from is going to change a lot. And you were hoping that Gigi could find that rhythm right away,
Right.
and know the right amount and find that comfortable spot. And you thought that might take some time. Well, now you're going to have to try to do that when the season's already going and you're trying to win games, as opposed to
That's
in
right.
the preseason, or, that to me, that's a real bummer for Taylor Jenkins, because I think it makes his job harder.
Yeah, I mean, if they're having other injury issues and they really need the bodies, then it'll be easier for him to get back. But the hope would be that's not the case. That they are playing well, that they are in the competitive mix as they expect to be, as they should be. And if other guys have stepped into those roles and are playing well, I think there's less leash for a player to sort of develop on the fly and sort of try to find their way when you're trying to win these games. And so that's sort of, will be the challenge. Again, I think this is a short-term problem for Gigi Jackson and less so for the Grizzlies than a long-term one. But I do think it's something that could set his season back even longer than the time he's out to injury, to your point. But I also think it's an opportunity for Jake LaRavia in particular.
It is, yes.
I mean, this is a guy who had barely played, and a lot of people had dismissed his ability to play based on not that much evidence, really. He finally, not unlike Gigi Jackson, gets a chance late last season when, the competitive part of the season's over, but he's getting lots of playing time. He's playing pretty well. Like Gigi Jackson, he had a productive summer league. He's older than Gigi. He should be further along. He's not as talented in raw terms as Gigi, but a similar situation where he has not had a chance to really establish himself as a rotation player in a competitive environment with better players. And he was probably on the outside looking in if this roster is at full strength for that role. But I think he's probably in a good position to be the 10th man in a 10-man rotation. He's got to earn it. I don't think it's going to be given to him, but I think he's in position to earn that role going into the season.
I do think you're right. And I think some of the same stuff we were saying about Gigi also applies in a slightly different way to Jake, which is he played well at the end of the season last year.
Getting a lot of shots. Yeah.
Yeah. In a setting where he got to take a lot of shots and be an important part of the offense. And now you're in a situation where you have to be efficient. Like you're going to need to be efficient to be productive. And is that going to be the case for Jake? He's had those opportunities in the past and he didn't produce.
Right.
But if what we saw this summer is the real Jake, then I think that you're going to and like he's got to stay healthy too. He hasn't been able to do that very well.
Right.
So now all of a sudden he's kind of important and you need him out there. And so, yeah, that to me, that's going to definitely be interesting. Does this worry you at all that like it could slow down Gigi's development? Like for me, he is the type of player. I will say this. This isn't to be critical, but like he's a little streaky. Like when he's at his best, like he can be really good. And I would guess that the Grizzlies' hope is that this isn't something that derails the direction in which he was headed because
I
I don't know what.
I I don't think it would. Yes, the short answer is yes, but I feel like the worst case scenario here is something of a lost second season. I don't think that's likely, but that to me it wouldn't. I think slow down, yes. Derail, no. I think he could have sort of like a second season that is not that's a bit of a mulligan second season, and then he's 20 years old going into next summer, and you're right back to getting him back on track. I think that's kind of the worst case scenario. And that's not a disaster. That's not what you want. That's not what you expect. I think, you want him to get back mid-season and get back in the groove and work his way into the rotation, late in the season. Um, there's a chance that that doesn't happen with him, but he is still so young and is under contract that I think the worst case scenario is more of a mulligan season for him instead of for the team. And so you want to try to avoid that, but that's not like a disastrous scenario long term for him either, honestly.
Okay, a few more topics I want to get to today. I'm going to move on to Jaren's camp, which I went to on Sunday. There's not all that much to talk about, and Jaren, expressed optimism about the team and that they had a good summer, and that they feel particularly connected. All the things that you would hear during an offseason press conference, right? Now, you usually don't hear much out of the ordinary. I just thought that it was nice to see him in that setting this weekend. He posted about that camp pretty late, just a few days before, and he had, I'm estimating here, close to 100 kids show up and be there on 901 day on Sunday. And he's just great with those kids. Like Jaren himself is just like a big kid. And he did the announcement. He talked about, this is how you get better. Everybody take this serious. And there's only one rule of the camp, or two rules of the camp. One was to have fun, and the other was that they can't guard him. None of the kids can guard him. He made that very clear, and then he proceeded to block some shots and dunks and whatnot. I thought it was great. And then Jaren spoke afterwards, or I guess just before he got started, and said, it's really good to just feel part of this community. And I've been here. He made the point. I've been here since I was 18 years old. Like, this really feels like home to me because when I got to Memphis, I was a kid. So this is what I kind of know. And if you know anything about Jaren's background, he moved around a lot when he was younger. And so I think it's nice that he starts to, that he's feeling, it's good to hear that he's feeling like Memphis is a place that he really enjoys and he considers to be home. And then we got a little Twitter exchange between him and Ja saying not to go anywhere, and Jaren responding with the lock emoji. Do you have any thoughts on Jaren's camp or the Twitter exchange? I know he's coming up on a year where he can play it out and then look for a contract extension.
Yeah, the Twitter exchange is interesting. I mean, Jaren still has 2 more years on his current contract. Eligible for an extension, but there are reasons that is unlikely. I think will be an emerging conversation. I mean, you may get into, a little bit of the situation Boston had with Jaylen Brown about, are you going to have supermax eligibility? Because that sort of changes the conversation a little bit. The thing with Jaren is that because he's on a descended contract and his contract is going down as the cap's going up, and what an extension means, you're extending off of a current contract, not you're signing a new contract. And extensions off of a current contract are based on the last salary in the current contract. And so even with the new CBA rules that increase the amount of percentage you can extend off, it's still probably too low for him. And so the likelihood is he'll go into free agency. And the question is going to be, when you get to that point, which is, almost 2 years from now at this point, what position are the Grizzlies in competitively and financially, and the relationship with Jaren and all of that. Those are big questions to explore over the next 2 years. But I think Jaren's really important to this team on and off the floor. And I would be surprised if the Grizzlies did not, whenever they can, make the kind of offer to Jaren that will at least match, if not exceed, what he would get anywhere else.
I think that when you talk about who has represented this franchise the best, Jaren has to be at the top of that conversation, right? Because of
Yep.
what he does in the community. I think Desmond Bane has done a very good job of that as well. But Jaren's been here the longest. He is the longest tenured Memphis Grizzly, and even longer than Taylor Jenkins. And so I think that, his importance to this community goes beyond just being a basketball player. And I think that that is definitely, it should be considered, I guess, when you think about the future. That should be the type of person that you want around your franchise, in addition to basketball. But basketball isn't always everything all the time. I do want to talk about Jaren's co-star, Ja Morant, but first, I'm going to tell you a quick message from our new sponsor, Chris, Youth Villages. Want to make a big impact without getting lost in a big system? Join Youth Villages to be a force for families while becoming part of one. Help make positive changes on a national scale, one community at a time. It takes a family to transform lives. Start with yours. Apply now at youthvillages.org/careers. So new sponsor, Chris. That's pretty cool. We have
Love
a
it.
sponsor starting in September. Okay, I've done some thinking about Ja Morant, and I did a little bit of writing, and I don't think the piece is up. I'm not sure if it'll be up when this podcast comes out, but we can discuss it now because there's not a whole lot going on this offseason. As I was thinking about what the biggest storylines are, I guess, going into the Grizzlies season, just a season outlook in general, it is correct, you think, to say the return of Ja Morant is atop that list, right?
Yeah, I think the idea that this is a reclamation season for Ja Morant and a reclamation for the team sort of goes hand in hand. In theory, you could have the first without the second, but I don't think you could have the second without the first. And so yes, I would agree.
Okay, so as I got to thinking about it, I just found it interesting because it does feel like Ja's a little out of sight, out of mind. We've done some talking about that. Like the hype around Ja isn't quite to the same level it was, let's say, prior to the 21-22 season, and especially last season, the 23-24 season, because he was in so many headlights because of the suspension. And now he's flying under the radar just a little bit. And it's just a very interesting position that he's in. And I thought back to it. When you were in New Orleans, I was at home sick with the flu, and we got the anecdote that Ja, before he hit the game-winning shot against the Pelicans, was trying to draw up a play for Jaren, and the team had to tell him, no, dude, you're the one taking the shot. It was almost like Ja had forgotten how great Ja Morant is. So let me ask you this. Do you feel like people have forgotten how good Ja Morant is when he's at his absolute best? Or is this just us thinking this because he's not part of the discussion this summer?
Yeah, I think, in that moment, he had hit two game-tying shots in like the previous two or three possessions. I think there was a fatigue issue in that moment, and maybe a little bit of a self-consciousness about like, am I really going to come back and take every single shot down the stretch? Should I let someone else have a turn? And he was disabused of that notion by Dez and by Jaren in that moment. I don't know if people have forgotten how good Ja is, but there are lots of good players in the league, and you're coming off of this playoffs where you've seen, Anthony Edwards be great, and Jalen Brunson be great, and Tyrese Maxey be great, and these are players that didn't even make it to the finals, right? Much less, Luka and Tatum there in the NBA Finals, and so I don't, it's not wrong for those, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who's the number one seed in the West. It's not wrong for those players to be a little bit more in the conversation than Ja Morant at the moment, based on what they've accomplished. I think for Ja, if I worked for Nike, I would be more concerned maybe, but I don't work for Nike, and so my thing is more like Ja's place in the NBA pecking order will be established by his play when the season starts, and it will be what it deserves to be based on what he does. And so I'm not that concerned about like, did they forget about Ja? Well, they're gonna play basketball. And then like he will either let them remind them or not, kind of thing. But I do think in terms of like when you separate past, and past could be what we just saw this spring, past could be 2 years ago. When you separate past from present and you're going into this current season and thinking about where players are relative to each other, I do think that that sense of distance collapses. I think you have to, even though Ja has been more out of mind than some of those other players I just mentioned, I think he's in the same group with them as you go into the season and should be thought of that way.
Yeah, as part of this exercise, I entertained the idea of why this could be Ja's best season as a pro. Better than that 21-22 season where he finished, inside the top 7, I think, of MVP voting
Yep.
and was in the conversation for a long time, and why this season could be better. And part of that exercise, before I get to those reasons, part of that exercise included looking at who the other guys are that are listed with MVP odds right now. And listen, this isn't a fair comparison because MVP odds are a projection of what the season could look like,
Right.
and team success and injury risk are part of those projections. And so I don't I'm not complaining about this. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. There should be no reason to complain about this. But you look at Jalen Brunson and Anthony Edwards, and they're in like the 14 to 15 to 1 range. If they played the season 15 times out, they think Anthony Edwards would win MVP once. Ja's closer to 34 or 35 to 1. And maybe that makes plenty of sense because Minnesota could be the very best team in the West. And Anthony Edwards had a tremendous summer for USA basketball. And he's at the forefront of basketball conversations, I think. And Ja is not. So it makes plenty of sense. But I would make the argument that in 21-22, Ja Morant played as good as Anthony Edwards or Jalen Brunson have played in their best seasons. Now, defensively, Anthony Edwards is a better player than Ja at this point. But I think offensive statistics win MVP awards. And so I just find that fascinating. Like, I consider Ja to be in that same tier of players, but right now he's not sitting in that same tier of players.
Well, I think the difference in I think the player comparison is interesting. I want to get into that, but I think the difference in the MVP odds, I think, is fairly rooted in two other things. One is the perception of likelihood of team success among those three teams, and the other is the perception of injury risk, or if you want to say, risk of absence, if you want to still throw Ja's off court stuff in there. I don't really consider that in my thinking anymore at this point. But even beyond that, injury risk, right? Or give a durability questions, I think is a better way to say it. You look at Ja's pattern of games played over the course of his career. He typically hits around 60 something. And so I think, the perception of likelihood of team success, perception of durability, I think is what those two things really factor into the difference in terms of the MVP odds. But to your point about just comparing the players on their own terms, they're pretty similar in terms of accomplishment. All three of those players, Ja Morant, Anthony Edwards, Jalen Brunson, have made exactly one All-NBA team. In all three cases, they made second team All-NBA. Edwards and Brunson did that last season. Ja did that a couple years ago. All three have been the top player, the perimeter alpha dog, the lead playmaker, shot creator for a team that's been a top 3 seed in their conference. Brunson and Edwards did that last season. Ja did that 2 years in a row before the last season. All three have played well in the playoffs. They've had huge playoff games. All three have advanced in the playoffs, but all three have probably fallen a little short of what they thought they were going to do or what they expected to do once they got in the moments of the playoffs, right? All three have to your point, have popped up on MVP ballots, but they've all three been in the also receiving votes portion, right? None of the three have gotten a first place MVP vote. So every marker of like individual accomplishment, regular season and postseason, it's very similar. They're all sort of in the same bucket. Ja's a little bit older than Edwards, a little bit younger than Brunson. Ja's also sort of in between those two stylistically. Like Edwards is a dynamite athlete, and Brunson's a control the game point guard. Ja's sort of both of those things. So it's an interesting comparison of those three players in particular. I think on the merits of their individual accomplishment, they are very, very similar to each other. And I think in terms of who's going to be better this season, it could come out in absolutely any order among those three players. All three are capable of jumping up, having a career year, and being a top 5 MVP ballot player. But it depends on how healthy they stay, how well they play, how well their teams play. I think it could go either absolutely any way, but I do think I, I think the Grizzlies could be as good or better than the Knicks or the Wolves, but I think it's a little bit more, it's a little bit safer prediction on Minnesota and New York going into the season. And I think the durability question with Ja, again, last year is a special situation, 9 games, whatever. But even in normal seasons, there's a durability, I think, question with Ja.
I would say that Brunson's season last year may have a very, very slight edge over Ja's best season, 21-22. You could make the argument that Ja had a better season in 21-22 than Edwards had last year. And yeah, it's just interesting because those guys, they do have the juice surrounding them heading into the season.
But I would throw some other, to me, it's interesting when you look at the top, guard perimeter players in the league. Like I think Luka is in a separate tier. I think there's a real question about whether Shea Gilgeous-Alexander is in the Luka tier or is he in the Ja Morant, Anthony Edwards, Jalen Brunson tier. But I think Devin Booker is in the tier with Brunson and Ja and Edwards. I think Donovan Mitchell's probably in that tier. But I think after that it drops. Like I don't put De'Aaron Fox in that tier. I don't put Damian Lillard anymore in that tier. Is Steph Curry there with Luka at this stage of his career, or is he down with Ja? Whatever. I think when you look at those players around the league, I think there's 1 to 3 players who are ahead of them on the perimeter, but otherwise, I think all those players are in that tier of you're not quite in the elite of the elite players in the league, like Jokic and Giannis and Luka and some of these guys are, but you're just right below that. You're the level just right below. And if you have your career season, as you think Ja might have this season, you can crash that party.
Yeah, on that. I mean, it does feel like this is going to be a pretty formative season for how we're going to view this iteration of the Grizzlies, right? Like this is like prove it. This is a prove it year for sure for this team. And I think it's also a chance to draw a line in the sand for Ja, that he is among those elite players. And if you wanted to look at this, and just bear with me, people, for a second, if you wanted to look at this pessimistically and find a reason why you didn't think Ja was going to be the same Ja this year, you would probably point to the fact that he's coming off of an injury, and eventually players will transition their games from a less, for lack of a better word, violent style to a safer style as they get older in their careers and their game changes. But there's been no indication that that's going to happen with Ja, right? Like, I still think he's going to be the same dynamic player that he was before, and he's not going to change his game because of this shoulder injury. This doesn't seem like that. This is that type of injury. And so I do think we're going to see the same Ja that we saw prior to the injury. And I think that he's just positioned really well this year. If you wanted to believe that Edey is going to be an upgrade over Steven Adams next to Ja, I think you can get to that pretty easily. I'm not saying it will 100% happen, but if you're trying to carve that path and find reasons why, I think you can get there pretty quickly. Just because Edey is going to be a better offensive threat than Steven Adams. I went back and watched some Edey screening stuff. And read up on, what people were saying about his screening techniques in college. And he seems like he's a pretty physical guy that kind of embraces that contact. And that's kind of what you need. You're trying to keep all of the nicks and bruises off of Ja Morant as much as possible over the course of a season. I think Edey's well equipped to do something like that. I also think that his offensive game is going to be beneficial to Ja. I think as long as this team stays healthy, we now have, the Gigi injury, obviously, it was a small blow, but I think surrounding him, you have probably more belief in the role players than you've had at any other point in his career at this stage. And so all of those things to me point up. And if you want to, and I just mentioned the shoulder injury as a negative, if you want to try to spin it positively, you could say, hey, look, Ja has now the chance to be refreshed and rejuvenated from a physical standpoint because he didn't take all those hits and blows over the course of a season. And now he gets to come into this new season as fresh as possible. I think you can, if you wanted to spin that positively, you can. And from a psychological standpoint, and this I don't feel like we really can't understate, it does feel like Ja is better when he has something to prove. Like when he had something to prove, when he was playing with that swagger, fine in the West, like that's the best version of Ja, in my opinion. And I do think that to have that back is of value to the Grizzlies.
No, I agree. And I think that kind of swagger and edginess of play, I think elevates not only his play, but elevates team play. It sort of gets everybody going. And I think I feel like he got away from that a little bit, coming off of some of his troubles, and wanted to be like, a little bit out of the limelight. But I I think dialing back your off court, not even activities, but your off court, like, the degree to which you're on social media all the time, to the degree to which you're sort of, putting yourself in front of people all the time. Dialing that back doesn't, to me, require dialing back the loudness of your play when you're on the floor. And so I do think Ja needs to play loudly when he is in the game. I think that's to his benefit. That's to the team's benefit. One of the things with Ja, like even when he was coming into the league, a lot of people made this point or wondered about this. Is he a guy who's going to peak early? Because of the durability questions, because his game seems so athleticism reliant, because of the shooting questions, all of that. And, people point to like Derrick Rose, won his MVP at age 22. And then he obviously had a career-altering injury, which Ja has not, hopefully will not have. But like Russell Westbrook, another player people would compare Ja to, he won his MVP at age 28. Ja just turned 25 this summer. And so my hope is that Ja Morant, but I think he is a better pure point guard than those players. And my hope is that he would develop an ability as he ages to sort of use, hopefully his shooting gets better, but also just use his ability to see the floor and control the game as a playmaker to sort of age gracefully and for his game to transition. But he's still only 25. Like it's not time for that yet necessarily. I think he is still capable of having a physically dominant end-to-end season in the same way he did 2 years ago. And there's no reason that couldn't happen this season, the year after that. And so, yeah, I think this is a big season for Ja. It's a big season for the team.
You think he could be in for his best season yet?
Why not?
What are you thinking? Yeah. I think that is this the best he's ever been situated coming into a season?
I don't know. I mean, again, they won 56 games a few years ago. They were second in the West. I mean, he finished, second team all NBA. That was a pretty good situation. I think this is a good situation. I think we have seen
that was a different time in the West.
This is true. But I think we have seen that and the Grizzlies have seen that Ja Morant thrives next to a big. He thrived with Jonas Valanciunas. He thrived with Steven Adams, and they placed the bet he's going to thrive with Zach Edey. And I think that's a good bet. I am not someone who was adamant that the Grizzlies had to get away from that and play like Jaren at center all the time and play 5 out and play that, you need the 5 out spacing for Ja. There's different kinds of spacing. The targeted spacing of this big dude setting a pick and you're darting into that space and you're making things happen, that works with Ja. It's worked for years, and I think it's going to work with Zach Edey. I don't think Ja needs a spread floor to dominate and to go off. I think he can dominate and go off, with a big man setting picks for him. And so I think the team is set up well if they healthy for Ja to have a big season, for the team to have a big season. I don't know that they're set up better than they were set up, when they won 56 games, but it's okay. Like that was a good season. If they win 56 games to finish second in the West and Ja is second team All NBA, I think that would not be uncharted territory. It'd be a great place to be for the Memphis Grizzlies.
Yeah. Well, just one quick counter. This is what I would argue to that. Yes, that team won 56 games. It was a different time in the West. But now you have a different version of even Desmond Bane than you had back then.
Yeah.
You have role players that you trust, like you've now discovered Vince. I mean, that team had Kyle Anderson and D'Anthony Melton. I understand that. That
team was super deep, top to bottom. I take your point about Desmond Bane though, and you can add Jaren.
And I think that Edey could be a better fit next to Ja.
Right. I think your hope is that your top 3 or 4 players collectively are better than them. I don't think you can assume your top 10 is better, But if your top 3 or 4 are better, and your 5 through 10 guys are just a little bit worse, that can still be a better basketball team.
Yeah. No, I would agree. I think that you may be right. 56 wins, that's a high bar to try to cross, especially given the way that things are situated now.
Well, even if it's not 56, I think second in the West would be spectacular.
Everybody would be thrilled with that. I would
right.
in a season like this one. Real quick, we're running out of time here, but speaking of Edey, I saw ESPN did like their preseason predictions vote. Edey got the most votes for Rookie of the Year, and I believe he has the best odds to win Rookie of the Year at this point. Your thoughts on that? Is how much of that has to do with Ja? I feel like a lot of it has to do with Ja.
Yeah, well, I think he is and we'll see what happens when the games start. Right now, he is the only rookie that I am projecting to be an opening night starter. And that's an opening night starter on a good team, and an opening night starter on a team where he can put up numbers. Points, rebounds, I think blocks. Now that they're going to let him, be a little bit more aggressive. So I think he is in position. He's a 4-year college guy who was super productive, and he's going to step into a starting role in a good team and a starting role that is set up for him to put up numbers. So I think he is best positioned to go for Rookie of the Year. I think the thing that would change would be if someone's great. Is Reed Sheppard just going to be great?
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be that kind of thing. I think if Reed Sheppard got drafted by the Wizards or drafted by some team where he was going to be the starting point guard from day one, Reed Sheppard would probably be the favorite to win Rookie of the Year. And so I think someone like Sheppard, someone like Stephen Castle, if one of those guys is just really good and crashes the starting lineup on their team, I think, they're a decent bet to win it. But I do think Zach Edey is set up best for anyone right now.
Yeah, I do too. And I think that this is not taking away from Zach Edey because this is hard work, but he is going to be in position to get some cheap buckets, right? Like when he gets to the rim and everybody goes to block the shot and he's standing right there and he gets an easy dunk, like that's going to help him in the box score.
He could easily just step right in and average like 14 points, 9 rebounds, 2 blocks on a winning team, like immediately. It's easy to see that. And
in a year where we don't know what any of these players are going to be, I mean, you're right. That's a pretty sure bet. So, I feel like Edey's going to be in that mix all year long, which will be fun for us to cover for sure. Well, that's going to do it for us this week. We will be back recording more podcasts as we approach the season. Training camp is coming up in a little less than a month now. So Chris and I will be covering everything from there. I appreciate you listening. As always, go listen to all the other Daily Memphian podcasts. But until next time, for Drew and for Chris, we're out of here.